All right, everybody. Welcome, Kamau. Hello. I'm glad you were able to join us.
Hey, how are y'all? I don't know. I was stuck in some form of digital jail that just would not let me hop on, but yeah.
You're here now. We were doing a little troubleshooting on the back end, y'all, but we are settled in. I'm going to run through a couple slides real quick, introduce Midwest BDC to everybody, introduce our guest speaker, and then Kamau, I'll be turning it over to you for the rest of the presentation. So welcome, everyone. And we are recording today, so if you want to share this afterwards or revisit some of the slides we're talking about, you can do that. I will be sharing out this recording with everyone after we've wrapped up. So without further ado, welcome to Energy Justice 101. My name is Maggie Heiser. I'm our communications manager here at Midwest BDC. And if you're new to our coalition or our work, Midwest BDC's mission is to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. And we know that everyone identifies the Midwest maybe a little bit differently, but our 8 priority states are Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa. We welcome folks from outside of those states too, but that's where we focus a lot of our advocacy, attention, and work. And today, before we kick off the presentation, I wanted to offer Midwest BDC's community norms. We might have time for some Q&A or interaction at the end, so I just want folks to keep these norms in mind while in our Midwest BDC space. I'll read them off real quickly. Our first one is notice intent, lean towards impact, use I statements, practice self-awareness, stop and witness, assume good intentions, listen for understanding, not to respond, wait, why am I talking? Why aren't I talking? Practice active listening. Everyone's a teacher, everyone's a learner. Share responsibility for keeping to these norms. Adhere to speak next indicators. Show up in your authentic self. Speak to the whole group. Minimize jargon and explain terms when you're asked. And participate and lean into discomfort. All right, and without further ado, I am excited to introduce our speaker for today. So Kamau Jawara is joining us. Kamau is a politicultural organizer from Detroit's East Side with passions for community and storytelling. Kamau uses political education and cultural strategy to support concentrations of energy justice, leadership development, and co-governance in order to build SEMI-ZIC. You'll have to tell us more about that, Kamau, our unified dream of organized residents of Southeast Michigan. We must be persistently curious and care for each other. That is to say, movement must start with developing the power and solidarity of Black Detroiters. And with that, I will turn it over to Kamau. If you want to introduce yourself while we kind of switch up the slide sharing, feel free. And I will be kind of logging off here and giving it over to you.
All right, appreciate it. Well, yeah, I'm happy to be here with y'all. So just FYI about me, I'll talk about it a little bit on a slide, but I'm Southeast Michigan lead organizer at We the People Michigan. We're a statewide org, which I'll talk about in a little second. But I'm happy to be here. This is the kind of second speaking piece I've done with, of course, Midwest decarbonization. Also, too, I'm not a code switchy person. So if you see me get up and I'm going towards the stove, it's because I'm like taking out my lunch. So we're gonna be comfortable today. That's just how we're moving. But really what I kind of position this to be is a training on one, what's up with energy? How are we getting our energy? What are some of the choices that have led us to the particular point we are with our energy crisis? And of course, lastly, how do we organize against it? And to create this more transformative just transition that we often talk about in the environmental justice arena. So a little bit about myself. I'm calling y'all over from the East Side. I grew up on the East Side, just 4 streets down from where my current house is. I'm an East Warren baby. That's what I always tell people, but was really raised with kind of the experience of getting engaged in the community, whether it was programs, whether it was like free opportunities, camps, like that was always my context. And for me, I was always cognizant of how a lot of the decisions are made for specifically Black boys, but also Black folk, without us being in a room and without, of course, our expertise. Often we see expertise as someone who has a college major or series of like academic channels that they've gone through, when really the people who are impacted most by the issue are the actual experts, because they can tell you how to navigate low income plan, or how to navigate bills and do the juggling act. They're actually the folk who we should be leaning on when we shape policies. And so for me, a lot of my reason for organizing started from my own experience organizing as a student at Wayne State around retention, where we raised about $60,000 for student programs, helped form organizations, and increase the Black male graduation rate. But it also extends to wanting to do that in the real world, where there's a lot of policy and budget and things that move in our communities, and how can we actually be at the table, but also expanding that table out to people who've never engaged politically before. And so that's a bit about me. I'm Southeast Michigan lead for We the People Michigan. We're an organization that is focused on what we call multiracial working class power. We do that through several campaigns. One, immigrant rights, housing, of course, education, and then lastly, what we call energy democracy or energy sovereignty. A little bit about our organization. We were formed about 6 to 7 years ago, really centered around one, the impact of emergency management, the impact of Flint, and thinking about all these different narratives that we hear across the state about other places that we're not from. Like you go to Detroit and the suburbs, you say like, we can't get things because the suburbs are getting X. And then you go to the suburbs and they say that we can't get things because Detroit is getting them. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to actually push back on those divide and conquer politics and start forming real solidarity, both structurally, but also too strategically, where we can move our issues as a unit across the state. And so that's what we do. I lead a campaign. So we said Semizaic a little second ago. Semizaic is just our fun kind of language we use for Southeast Michigan mosaic. We want a mosaic of different types of people. We often focus on Detroit to downriver, which has, of course, like one of the largest Black populations in the country, one of the largest Arab populations in the country, and also a large Latina population as well. And so when we're thinking about this Southeast Michigan mosaic, really that's how we built out the campaign we call People's Power Program. We're focused on how do we, of course, link a lot of these issues together, but how do we move forward in bringing these people to the table on climate fights? So thinking about Black, Arab, Latina folk that often don't engage in environmental justice because it's just not something that people are engaging them in. How do we make them experts and also too like key strategists and key architects in shaping the future of it? So of course we're a team of 4: myself, Leila Labed, Charity Turnbow, and of course Maria, who's our organizing director at We the People Michigan. So now I'll get into the meat and potatoes of just like how we got here. And you're gonna see me get up because like I said, I'm grabbing my lunch out of the oven. But really, when we think about how we get here, we have to think about what we call the 3 faces of power. So really, this is a framework for how we understand policy change and how we understand the conditions that we live in. So there's really 3 faces of power. 1, there's who decides. 2, there's who sets the agenda. And 3, what is the dominant narrative? And so I'm going to break those down using a bit of a case study of something that we all lived through. And I'm sure we all have personal memories with, but I want to use it as really kind of a springboard to understanding how do we get to the particular political context that we're in now. So if we want to rewind the clock back to the early 2010s, we all remember this thing called Public Act 4. What this was an emergency management law that said that of course, state government had the ability to take any city or school district that is deemed in financial crisis and install an emergency manager who would have unilateral decision-making over how that thing would be operated. So they could cut spending, they could cut budget, they could make all of those decisions without the will of the people. So some things that are significant is 1, Governor Snyder signed Public Act 4 into law. It passed both through the House and the Senate. This is a time where we have, of course, a Republican majority. I know a lot of folks are aware of this because as we have the first trifecta, Democrat trifecta in almost 40 years. So this is a different political context that we were in, where they were kind of doing what they felt like doing, and the pushback within the legislature wasn't super strong. So on November 6th, of course, voters across the state, they had organized that whole year to actually use the referendum, which means that they could take the issue to the ballot and they could strike down that law through the popular vote. It's something that passed, and I always love to put this picture here because it's Mama Monica, who's a dear elder to myself. But a lot of folks, of course, got together across labor, across residents, across organizations, To make this possible, something that's significant is that in Detroit, about 82% of people voted, of course, this law down. So we get this big public win of people that voted this law down because they weren't interested in emergency management. And then Snyder doubles down. On December 2012, during lame duck session, which we know is the period right after the election where often we see a lot of like kind of degenerative policy pass. Why? Because they know that they're on the way out. They're like, all right, let's pass some things real quick. So they passed Public Act 436, which is basically the same bill. However, it's modified to have a 30,000 appropriation, making it referendum proof. So this means that in order to, of course, like push for a referendum, this is money that folk actually had to, like this was tied to the state budget during the appropriation process. So what they did is they made it so that folk could not strike this down through the popular vote again, pushing it through. What this does is this makes a lot of what we've seen for the past decade and some change possible. Of course, Detroit Public Schools, Hamtramck, Ecorse, Benton Harbor, Pontiac, Highland Park, Muskegon Heights, Allen Park. And specifically, when we look at emergency management, the Flint water crisis does not happen without Public Act 436. And so we're seeing, if you look at this, you see a majority Black cities, Black and brown cities, where the governor then made unilateral decisions for the communities below. And this impacts everything. This impacts, of course, we see like right to work laws. We see how this impacts unions, contracts, water. And we start seeing things that were public services start becoming private. In Detroit, we saw this with our water company becoming private. We saw this with our trash collection becoming private. And we see this, of course, with our energy provider becoming even increasingly more powerful in the city of Detroit. So if we want to talk about second phase of power of who sets the agenda, we have to think about how this stuff is shaped, because it just doesn't, lawmakers often don't just like sit overnight and write a bill and then like go to session. Often there are containers where bills are written. And so when we think about Public Act 4, it was written by the Mackinac Policy Center, which is a right-wing free market think tank in Michigan. I'm sure you see some familiar faces here. You see the Prince family, you see the DeVos family, of course. You see the Koch brothers, you see, of course, the Waltons, but also a lot of our business and corporate interests here in the state. When we think about Dow, think about Exxon, GM, this is something that they wanted, and they were willing to build policy around it through think tanks. Often when we think of bills, they're written through some of these think tanks, and then they're lobbied in, of course, session or lobbied outside of session in all of these different spaces. But they play a key role in attacking unions and shaping like what we call like an ideological trajectory from a policy perspective. They're not just thinking about, we want to do a thing because we want to win right now. They're thinking about how can we impact the state. So when they, of course, passed right to work laws, when they passed emergency management law, they're thinking about a state that's like, Michigan is the vanguard of the labor movement. We think about the Flint sit-down strikes in the 30s. We think about the 60s moving forward. If they could strike down some of these rights in Michigan, it would be possible in other places. Which leads us to the third phase of power, which is what is the dominant narrative. And so we tend to use the Overton window to describe this. This is named after Joseph Overton from the Mackinac Policy Conference Center. And what it is it's actually a framework where we ask the question of how do we take an unpopular idea and how do we make it popular? And so when we're thinking about what I said before, a state like Michigan, where unions, where labor, where working class, like power, are things that we are not unfamiliar with, how can they actually make those things inconceivable? Now, granted, we just saw last year right to work laws were, of course, stricken down, which is great, but we actually lived for a decade in a context where unions were at their weakest they had ever been because of a policy decision that they made and they forced us into and then did the necessary lobbying to move it. And so when we're thinking about how we start thinking about our utilities, whether it's energy, whether it's water, whether it's trash, et cetera, this is where we start seeing, specifically if we're going to talk about DTE and consumers, this is where they become even more established into the, nonprofit sphere of funding nonprofits, increasing their, of course, contributions politically, because they're understanding that like we now have a political context where one, the will and the spirit of the people is broken, but also too, like we want to start moving in the same direction that water is moving. We want full control. We want a monopoly of the energy grid, and we want to start moving in a way that will like, hey, like no one's going to stop us from doing it. So I want to just use this as just like, we're not going to spend too long on Three Faces of Power. I wanted to just use it as like a bit of a backdrop of how do we get to the context that we're in regards to our energy. And then I want to kind of talk about one, like how do we get energy and some of the things that we're seeing with specifically with our energy grid. So one, I think the biggest ways that we actually get energy to our homes is both coal and nuclear gas. So these are a few sources that you see. You see strip mining, which is a very small aspect of our energy here in Michigan. There's fracked gas, and then there's nuclear gas and coal. So specifically here, our Monroe power plant actually has the third largest generating capacity of any coal-fired power plant in North America. I think the only ones leading it are in Georgia and South Carolina. And so a moderate sized coal plant cost about $1.2 billion to build. The Monroe one actually costed about $8 billion to build. And it's, of course, staying open for the immediate future until about 2040. And there's actually other talks to build new coal and invest even more in coal. But also we're seeing a conversation in wanting to invest more in nuclear. These are specifically some of the big ways that we're investing in energy at the moment. Of course, those travel from plants to transformer lines to substations, which is what you generally see maybe in your neighborhood or not too far outside of your neighborhood. And then they go to power lines. But the big thing to notice here is that DTE is not just an environmental actor in the sense of like power outages. They're actually influencing a lot of these energy sources in other states and also too influencing policy in other states. So when we're thinking about some of the capacity that DTE is able to build, it's not actually unfamiliar to hear that they're in another state and extracting, whether it's coal, whether it's extracting gas, on indigenous land. And so there's specifically been some fights with the Lakota Nation against DTE outside of Michigan because their scope is not just, hey, we're just a corporation in Michigan. They're actually a corporation with shareholders that are not all necessarily here in Michigan. But the second takeaway is that we're not getting energy in the cleanest, most cost-effective way. So when we think about wind, when we think about geo, we think about hydro, solar, those aren't the major priorities of DTE. Despite what we hear, those are not actually places where they're putting major investments. They're actually trying to control the narrative to the degree that like, we're going to keep doing the thing that we're doing, and we'll maybe do a little bit just to meet quota, but we're not actually going to change a lot of our decision making to resolve a grid where people have more agency over how they get energy to their homes. So some framing that is important around just one, like how we get our energy and what is the impact is we like to look at four things. We look at health harms. So when we think about, of course, how outages impact people who are diabetic or folk who are have newborns or folk who are disabled and have scooters, like these different stories. We think of redlining, so thinking about how disproportionately people in Black, brown, and rural communities are paying more for their energy and getting the worst rates, which we'll talk about in a second. And we talk about profit extraction. So thinking about the fact that since 2010, we've had 6 rate increases requests come through DTE, where they're asking for, charging ratepayers more so that they can resolve the grid, but we're not seeing the same investments made into the grid. And then lastly, there's damaging democracy, which is when we think about a corporation with shareholders that is like consistently lobbying in Lansing, they're talking to our lawmakers, they're influencing decisions, they're making campaign, of course, donations. It actually shapes what's possible from a policy perspective. Why? Because we think, even for Democrats, they want to stay in office. They don't want to lose seats, especially marginal Democrats. And so often they're going to come to the table and they're going to think about, okay, I need to take funds because I need to stay in office. So that actually influences, one, our ability to move transformative policy. So I'll make this part, this is the quick and just like, here's the filth part of kind of the training is just talking about specifically utilities and then how DTE and consumers are showing up as utilities. So when we think about the types of utilities we have in the country, the majority of them are public utilities. There's about 2,000 plus public utilities in the country. So this means that they're ran at a municipal or county level. There's private investor-owned utilities, what we call IOUs, which is what DTE and Consumers and UPCO in the Upper Peninsula are. It's about 200 of those. And then there's cooperative power, which means that the folk that own the grid are also maintaining the grid and they're using it. So it's in their neighborhood. They have agency over it. They also have to, of course, like do the maintenance and all those things. But there's about 800 of those across the country. So you'll see that the majority of utilities are actually public utilities. However, private utilities have the largest percentage of customers and the largest percentage of sales. And so when we think about DTE specifically, this is some data that is like available in our DTE report, which is on our website. I think the first map that's super important is the one on the left, when we think about specifically who's paying the most when there's outages. So specifically people who are a little bit poorer and more rural communities, more low income communities, they're actually out of power twice as long as people who aren't. But also when we look at electronic distribution by census tract, so this is dividing up, voltage based on where you live, there's actually a case that can be made that people who are in Black rural neighborhoods are actually getting less voltage readily to their outlet than folk who are in suburbs. So it's about 4.8 kilovolts to 13.2. Now, within that, a lot of the infrastructure that we're seeing specifically in Black neighborhoods, they're 10 to 24 years past their life expectancy. I remember talking to a line worker who shared that like this was during the outage last year in February, where about 1 million people were out of power. He shared that like a lot of folk would rather work in the Philippines than work in Michigan, and that at that particular moment, there were so many people out of power that they were bringing electricians from out of state to actually resolve an outage, because a lot of the lines were super old, some of them dating back to even World War II is what he stated. And so thinking about the infrastructure that we have and also the cost that's required to, of course, like mend it when there's an outage, there's actually a good case to be made that like a lot of the investments that they should be making are not necessarily in shareholders, but they should be in the infrastructure. And those things aren't happening. In addition to that, when we look at rates and how much we're being charged, DTE and Michigan in general, we're paying some of the highest rates in the country. So when you see DTE low and DTE high, that is distinguishing people who are on payment plans and people who aren't. What you'll see is that people who are on payment plans, low income plans, they're actually paying the majority, they're footing the majority of the bill. Why? This is something that I remember Senator Mary Kavanaugh broke down really well. For a lot of folk who are on low income plans, they're paying more fees, but those fees just might be less. And so often they're not actually noticing how much they're being charged for their DTE bill. If we look at those rates and how they impact us in relation to kind of what we call industry or manufacturers, we're actually paying about 2.5 times more than manufacturers. So when we think about plants, we think about, of course, Little Caesars Arena, some of the big venues, they're not actually footing the majority of the bill for our energy grid since 1992. We actually are as residents. In addition to that, this is kind of what I sparked out a couple slides ago. When we think about these rate increases and kind of the argument they make that like, hey, we need to invest in the grid, we need to charge you more for your energy. The majority of those rate increases does not actually go into the grid. About 73% of it goes specifically to shareholders. And then 27% goes to everything else. So when we think about everything else, that does not necessarily guarantee that all of that money is being invested in our grid. A lot of that is going into marketing or going into salaries. Like those are other things that are, of course, like spending costs for DTE. But the shareholder payouts in 2022 specifically were about more than $2 billion, which could have paid the unpaid bills of everyone they shut off that year 52 times over. So I'm seeing the question of marketing from Jelani. One, good to see you, because we'll get there in a second. It's in about a slide or two. Moving on from just like one, their impact. We want to talk about one, like the actual spending that they're doing. So one, campaign donation. So we have more recent data than this, but in 2022, about 140 out of 146 legislators actually had taken money from DTE and consumers. One thing that's great and a comfort to our ears is that because of a lot of the work from organizations like ourselves, we actually made it so that folk could not be endorsed unless they were agreeing to not take DTE money. And so what we actually saw last year, we saw about 50 legislators that actually did not take money from DTE for their campaigns, which is really great. It's progress. When we're thinking about lobbying, specifically between 2019 and 2021, we saw them put almost $1 million into lobbying. One of the big stories that broke in The Guardian was that while they were, of course, going to Black churches and donating masks and things of that sort, they were also putting money and investing in lifting a lot of the COVID restrictions. And so they were fighting the COVID restrictions that Governor Whitmer was enforcing to keep us all safe, because they were playing both sides of the aisle. They wanted, of course, to create a political context where workers had to go back to work. They were also, of course, lobbying for more rate increases while we were, of course, like in a pandemic, and they're also shutting people's power off while they're investing in some of the like political lobbying of how do we shape the political future. And then lastly, dark money. I'm not going to get super into the weeds of like C4 and all of the like legal organizations, but Michigan Energy First is, of course, DTE C4 capacity, where they're able to put money into specifically community groups, specifically candidates. And so they donated over $5 million to over a dozen groups, with much of the money being spent just influencing elected officials and public opinion. So we'll get into some of the specifics of some of that. One, there's about $1.2 million that was given to environmental groups from 2018 to 2019. So when we think of environmental groups, these are what we call big greens. So they're often thinking about how can we just pass a bill? Like we want to pass something bipartisan. We want to get something out in the legislature and vote it for. And so often DTE is going and sitting at the table with those folk and donating to those folk. But also when we think of kind of smaller orgs, community orgs, a lot of our nonprofit programs, arts and culture, specifically in Michigan, those are also other spending channels of DTE. So there's hundreds of orgs from 2015 to 2020 that received about $120 million. What this does is this, of course, proposes them as a good actor. They're a good civic actor of like, I'm going to put money into this arts and culture program. One of the ones we often joke about is there's a yearly event, Hallelujah for Heat, that is hosted at Fellowship Chapel, where famous gospel singers come and they pass out backpacks, and it's a major PR event for DTE specifically because it's co-hosted by both the church and DTE. And ironically enough, like when we see outages happen, that same, of course, capacity is not something that DTE is putting out to support people. But when we think about their contributions to local organizations, this is one of the ways they're able to shape the public opinion on DTE. There's also, of course, $2 million towards political candidates since 2018. And specifically, I like to draw this one out as someone who, of course, grew up in the church. There's almost $1 million that has gone specifically towards leadership from faith-based organizations since 2018. To break down what that looks like, often for the faith-based community, they might show up as business owners, or they might show up as folks sitting at the regional chamber. And so often for their personal ventures outside of their spiritual practice, they're receiving money specifically from DTE. About $124 million, of course, is gone, and this is just marketing. So if you look at that number, $124 million, one, that's a lot of money, but that's not going into like the grid, that's not going into families' pockets, that's not being reimbursed to people. That is just going to advertisement. And so this is all data that you can see in our DTE report, which of course I will link at the end. But this is to make the case that DTE spending, their participation in our, of course, political system, but also to their impact on families are three things that are super major that we're all feeling and things that we need to be thinking about as we're organizing our DTE. And so I'll just pull us back to kind of what we talked about with the, three faces of power. There's the decision maker, DTE, of course, and of course the lawmakers. There's of course the, dominant narrative that they're wanting to propose, which is like, hey, this is how energy should be. One corporation should be responsible for our energy grid. And then there's also who sets the agenda. When we think about folk who are lobbying for DTE, we're thinking about shareholders. Those are the folk that are deciding that like, this is what our energy grid should look like. So I get to the fun part that's not so like doom and gloom. It's like, how do we organize around climate harm? And specifically, how do we move towards what we call energy sovereignty? So one, I'll start us here. I actually get this kind of graph from David C. Turner, who's an organizer out from LA, who I had the pleasure of meeting pretty recently. But I think it's pretty applicable to what we see with energy. So one, in order for us to organize effectively towards energy sovereignty, we actually need to have both a critique of the oppressor as well as we need to be motivated. The reason for that is because when we have motivation to do a thing, but we're not critiquing the oppressor, we're actually just doing conformist resistance. This is where we say, like, how can we fix DTE? How can we just like go through kind of what we've been doing before and just keep trying it until it works? There actually is a necessity for us to be critical of DTE consumers and UPCO to say that this might not be the way that we should receive energy to our homes. But also, too, if we're critiquing the oppressor, but we're not motivated, this is often where we get into the realm of cynicism, where it's like, I know things are really bad, but I don't necessarily know what steps I should be taking to organize against them. And if there's neither a critique of the oppressor nor motivation, often we're in a state of inertia. We're not getting to try anything, to test any strategy. So what we want to do is we want to generate a movement that is not just reactionary. We're not just reacting to decisions that are being made, but we're also shaping a future of what does energy look like for us and how does it actually move us closer to liberation, as opposed to how do we resolve what exists right now and just try to make it work. The reason for this is often what we call values-based organizing. So one, this is where we ask the question of whether we want to problem solve or we want to problem pose. So when we're problem solving, often we ask very close-ended questions. We might ask questions like, how do we improve police, community relations with people of color? What can make boys of color behave better in school? When we problem pose, we ask more open-ended questions where we say, why do people of color distrust the police? What type of social climate are boys of color responding to in their classes and campuses? And so when we think about our energy grid, because it's a monopoly, you go and you talk to most people, it's very hard for them to grapple with what energy could look like outside of DTE. Why? Because it's their only option. Or if they're in the west side of the state, it's consumers. If they're in the north, it's UPCO. But it's their only option. So they're not necessarily being able to vision beyond that point.
Get to know.
Okay, my phone's listening to me. Which is a problem-solving question. We say, like, how do we fix DTE? Or how do we make DTE better, more accountable? You'll hear this language often where people say we need to hold DTE accountable. You cannot hold a monopoly accountable without people power. And you also can't hold them accountable if there's no incentive or structural situation for them to be accountable to people if they're the only option. So what we actually have to do is we have to problem pose. It means that we have to go to communities and ask more open-ended questions of, what are your thoughts on DTE? How is DTE, like, how is your energy grid impacting you? How is your energy bill difficult for you? Like, getting a full understanding of what people are experiencing so that when we go into the policymaking process, we're not going alone just trying to fix a single issue. We're going saying, how is this a step towards a broader future that is anchored to what people need, the most impacted people? Sometimes we call this non-reformist reforms in the sense that we're willing to move within our particular political context, but we're anchored towards a long-term goal. And what we're doing right now is giving us the power necessary to win on bigger shit. So that's often where we want to be, is we want to be in the realm of problem posing, which is more values-based. It's more invitational. You'll notice if you go out to someone who is, heavily impacted by DTE, they might be at risk of shutoff or on a payment plan. They actually don't necessarily yet want to talk about the legislature. They actually want to wrestle with, okay, like, how do I get out of this immediate situation? And like, why is this my particular situation? So it means slowing our pace down a bit and accepting that our fight towards a better energy grid is not a 1 year, 2 year thing. It's a 10 to 15 year fight. But the things that we can do right now is we can actually invite people in based on values. So the reason we do that, there's nothing here in this Venn diagram. It's solely for design. And so that we can move into the realm of synthesizing both transformative change and policy change. So when we think about transformative change, we have a surplus of people that are interested in this in Michigan, where we think about our more grassroots spaces. We think about kind of the farming and green and urban agriculture community. There's many communities that are asking the question of how do we create better systems outside of the context of electoralism. So they're maybe less interested in elections, maybe less interested in the political process, but they are interested in how do we transform the systems that we're living in. Then you have folk who are more on the policy change side. So when we think about lawmakers specifically, like this is their work. Like their work is to move policy, but also too we think about labor, where of course they are closely tied to the policy making process. We think about business, we think about corporations, but also folk who are more invested in the political arena. What we actually need is we need both of those folk to be engaging in both. So how do we, of course, engage politically, electorally, but how is it anchored towards a long-term or transformational change, as I was talking about a couple slides ago. So part of our organizing work is being able to do a bit of this, like getting reads on people where they sit, and then moving actions that move people understanding more towards there's actually a need for us to engage in this election for this specific reason that puts us in position for something more long term. This is a shift from what we often hear, which I'm sure you've all heard it, like this is the most important election of your life. If you don't vote this, then you're voting this. Yeah, all of those statements that come out during election years where people are kind of used as political footballs. But what's actually necessary is for us to be thinking about these external events, elections, rate cases, as opportunities to make long-term plays, and also to synthesize the interest of some of these different parties. Which leads us to power theory. Just a question, okay, like how do you do that? Like how do you move people into one container? We the People Michigan, we are an org that we believe in power theory. What power theory is it's real simple. It just asks the question of how many people are necessary to influence change within the political arena. So we resolve that power is obtained through people. The process of building that capacity is often what we call base building. So as you're building power, building leadership, we call that base building. Now, there's really three main questions that we ask in a power theory, and they're super simple. It's who are my people, what is their problem, and how can they use their resources in new ways to obtain change? What we have to do specifically with the EJ arena is that we need to let go of all of our like, I majored in this, or I'm a electrical engineer, or I'm an expert here. The reality is that organizing is not something that you go to school for. You can, but at the end of the day, it's actually the practice of being able to invite people in and develop them to a degree where their action can influence the systems they're living in. So we bring it down to earth. It's, hey, this person in the community or this person in the church, they know 5 people. They can bring 5 people to a meeting, or that person is really good at doing potlucks, and so they can bring the food. Or it's being able to assess the skills that people have, because often they don't see those things as resources. We're kind of taught that our only resource that we have is our vote. And yes, that is one of our resources in our toolkit, but often we have much more than that. A great example to give from our immigration campaign was when they were building out the campaign in 2022, they, of course, launched a movement school where they absorbed undocumented leaders to have house meetings where they just gathered, they cooked food, they were fully in Spanish. They went to the migrant farms and talked to people. And from that, they were able to, of course, do a lot of the organizing last year that they got of moving them to a place where they had the majority of votes in the legislature to pass driver's licenses. And now, granted, it's something that they still want to pass, but right now, when we think about where they were in 2022, there were a few of them, and now there's actually 500 plus of them across the state that are moving action collectively together. Part of that is possible when you bring it down to earth and you say, okay, how do I invite people into easy entry points and also get them to understand what resources they have that they can use? So that's where you start. I'll go into just like some basic, just like this is just organizing 101, but it's essential for how we think about the energy sovereignty fight is one, understanding self-interest. So I like to think of this as like the first thing an organizer does is they ask that question of what compels me to engage in the work of organizing. For me, like I said, I'm a Black dude from the East Side. I never saw myself as someone who would be in environmental justice. What changed for me was actually in 2021, where we had that big flood, June 26th, and my apartment flooded the second day I was there. It was up to my knees in water, and I remember going to public meetings and asking like, why did this happen, and like, are we going to be made whole again? And there were no answers, and it was kind of like, this is going to keep happening. Be patient. We're going to launch some programs maybe down the road, but there weren't answers for me. And I actually realized that for me, I actually need to be getting involved in climate fights. Why? Because I was personally impacted by it. Um, so I see some questions populating. I want to hold those for the end because I think maybe kind of opening up for um, some of those at the end could be good. Um, so one, like for me, what compelled me to do it was like personal experience with a climate issue. I remember going to that, particular meeting and them saying our power provider lost power at the pump station. They wouldn't say that it was DTE, even though we all knew it was DTE that lost power at the pump station. So self-interest is really where we evaluate, one, our lived experience, being clear on how our lived experience calls us to leadership and allows us to invite others into action. um, Being clear on our public leadership. So like, you are not a savior. You are not, Jesus or Superman or whatever superhero is your favorite. Your responsibility is to develop courage and curiosity and skills of other people. And so what that often means is that for your self-interest, when you go out and you talk to someone, you say, I'm really interested in an energy grid that is like owned by the people. And they say, I'm really interested in someone fixing my sidewalks because DTE messed them up. You might have different self-interests, but they're actually aligned towards something long-term. And it's being able to have that conversation to say, how can you move collective action together? But lastly, there's the reflection piece. So you got to be curious. You cannot go into communities of color, impacted communities, and say, I know all the answers on what we need to do with our energy grid. That's great if you do. Like, God bless your heart. If you like it, we love it. But when you talk to folk, you have to meet them where they are. Often families are like incredibly burdened by their energy bills or other impacts. Sometimes we even see things of like, hey, DTE cut down some trees and they just left them in the alley and they never came and cleaned it up. And it actually makes me feel bad about my walkway or my community or it's in my backyard. Like, those are things that we actually need to hold a lot of space for. It's not that they're less important or whatever. It's like, no, that's that person expressing what they need for them to get more involved. And often, if we're able to win on those smaller things, someone then has the momentum to say, oh, like, we can actually do some things. We can move action together. So getting clear on what our self-interest is, but also the self-interest of other people is one of the most important things that we can do in building an energy sovereignty fight that is strong and actually sustainable. So beyond that, there's building power. So this is where we get into, like, once you're clear on what you're doing, what you want to do, why you want to do it, you got to go meet some people. You got to go build some power. I tend to say that one-to-ones are like the bread and butter and the most important thing that an organizer can have in his toolkit. One-to-ones are purposeful conversations with community members where you get clear on each other's self-interest and you make a commitment to work together in building power. So they're, like I said, they're the most important tactic because naturally when we start organizing, often if we're able to perceive that there's a problem and that there's potential solutions, we might think super broad down the road of like, oh, we need to build this strategic team and coalition and so forth and so on. But you didn't answer the question of who's going to be in that container, who's going to be in that coalition. So we often start with, this is something I do with my organizer who just actually started a month ago, is we put it on a wall of like, who all do you know? Where do they sit on this issue? How aligned are they with you? How powerful are they? And when are you going to go talk to them? Because what we need to do is we need to understand who's in our neighborhood and like what resources do they have. This is helpful for people who see them like organizing as like this incredibly difficult, impossible task, because it pushes them to say that like you actually know 6 to 10 people in your personal life who are impacted by this issue who you can talk to this week or you can talk to this month. That actually gives them the experience to wrestle with some of the skills of organizing and to say like, oh, like I'm much more powerful than I thought I am. From that, that's where we get the context to build leadership teams. So when I was making that point about, building coalitions, building containers, building committees, core teams or chapters, those are things that are only possible if we have the people to do them. If you build a core team without talking to any people, you're not going to have the best perspective on how to approach the issue. And you're also cheating yourself of some great opportunities. Um, Perfect examples of this is like often in our community, there's someone that is like artistic and able to make signs, or someone that notices something that you might not have noticed. I remember having a really great conversation with someone very recently. They're one of our leaders on our campaign. And, we were just talking about how a lot of the, faith-based community that we like want to organize, a lot of the leadership don't actually live in Detroit. And so they're not actually that important in being constituents of Detroit lawmakers, but also they're not Detroiters. So they might be great for like, we need to build a relationship with them and work with them, but we need to be evaluating in their congregation, who are the leaders, who are like the old ladies that know everybody business, or who's the deacon that is like invested a little bit in social, like we need to be making those reads to build out leadership teams to make sure that the folk who are leading on campaigns are impacted by the issue, but also have the skill of doing that first thing, meeting people, recruiting people, absorbing people into the movement. Now that's something that like, it was a great conversation to have with the leader. It came because of his perspective being a Detroiter. Now, had I asked somebody who wasn't a Detroiter, they probably wouldn't have told me that, right? And so often when we're, going and we're meeting people, we want to be able to, one, like go in with what do we think we know about this person and how they can, of course, be absorbed into the movement. But then we have to confirm that hunch, either through talking to them and then extend it, like taking action with them. And lastly, there's kind of like deploying power. I like to say this is like the third module of, organizing, which is where we ask the questions of, now that we have people, now that we have structure, where like this team is going to be working on this particular campaign and issue, we need to do some strategizing. We need to power map, where we, of course, ask about like, questions about who has power, why do they have power, and what ways does it show up in the political and public arena. And then we need to reflect on our allies and like, okay, how are we working with our allies? How are we moving forward towards this long-term goal? From that, we build campaigns, which is kind of the synthesis of interest and resources. So often when we talk about power, power is not this like thing that you just have or like a quality or trait. It's the relationship between interest and resources. That is to say that their interest might be, I really want to pass this bill. I'm going to use my money to help me pass it, or I'm going to use my relationships to help me pass it. So often power is someone using their resources to push their interest forward, but campaigns are us building resources over time. And so it's kind of that continuous negotiation with the community to say like, hey, we just won on this thing. What do you think should be next? What do we have right now to move that? Or do we have enough resources to move it? And being able to be honest about those reads. But as we're doing that and taking action, we are in amidst what we call a campaign. Within that, there's the need to mobilize. So when we think about base building, It's great. Like if you have 100 people that you've like built relationships with, if they don't take action, they will not have the opportunity to learn what's possible. This is super important when we think about specifically policy wins, because often when we might see a really great policy pass, but if there aren't the people there to make sure that that policy meets the people who most need it, it kind of falls flat. We're kind of seeing this right now, specifically with the IRA. It's a great series of bills that President Joe Biden passed to influence cities' ability to like, hey, we can help families do weatherization projects or get home repairs. The challenge is that a lot of people, not enough people know that it exists and are intervening to be able to snatch that money at the county level for impacted low-income families. So when we think about mobilization and we think about kind of base, we want them to be in a rhythm of taking action so that they have the experience to actually like feel like the win is theirs. Sometimes we see bills and like, oh, that's great, but I don't know, like it doesn't feel like mine. We want our people to own that win and to say that like, this is something that we worked towards. So really that's what we get money for weatherization at the county level. So yeah, I can only say a little bit. I am not a professional on the IRA, but what I will say is that when we consider federal dollars often that are moved through big bills like the IRA, they go through counties for the most part. And so I think we're seeing, I'm going to butcher the name of it. I think it's like the greenhouse gas reduction. And it's a part of the IRA. And I think it's about a $27 billion program that is like being launched under the IRA right now that is going to be going into specifically like states. And it's going to go through the county level. It actually means that there's a lot of opportunities for impacted families to be saying, hey, we need to go to our city lawmakers, our legislature, our county lawmakers, and making sure that they build out local programs to make sure that that money gets to families. That's all I'll say. I'm not, like I said, I'm not the biggest profession. I know I'm going to some sessions soon to kind of learn a little bit more about how federal dollars track down, but in the broad sense, that is like a consistent strategy that we see in environmental justice organizing is going after county money, federal county money, and then securing that for families. Um, so as for campaigns, what we see with kind of this process, what we talk about base building, is campaigns are just this. When we look at it as like an XY chart, you can look at Y is capacity, so how many people are engaging with it, and then X is time, so over time. Really, a campaign is like how do we engage more people over time? So we start with this really firm foundation. Often we do a big kickoff or thing, and then we might drop off, which is 3 right there. But it's having the muscle to say that, like, okay, we did a thing with 40 people, 15 people came back. Let's invest in these 15 people and then see what's possible. It's a continuous series of that. And also creating opportunities for people to engage in the campaigns in the ways that make sense for them. But from that, we're able to meet what we call peaks, where it's like we won on this thing, or we staged a big action to display that, like, this is how many people are engaging in the campaign, or a lawmaker now, of course, has moved in our favor and is willing to move a particular bill forward. Those are all things that we can see as peaks. And within that, I think I put it farther on accident. The way that we scale success in organizing specifically is through one, like meeting our goals, so having concrete and specific goals that we can reach, building capacity, so absorbing more people in the campaign over time, and then lastly, learning. So if you learn something, you probably are doing a pretty decent job organizing. Often we think about, things as like we lost or losing. Those actually open up opportunities for you to learn more about the political arena. You might learn where a lawmaker stands on an issue, or you might learn that, like, oh, this person that I've been relating to is actually a really good leader, and I want to invest even more in their leadership. Those are things that, of course, are successes in organizing. So I'll share, oh, great. So I'm seeing people are sharing things in the chat around the IRA. I think Rewire America also has some really good resources, but I'll link some of those probably at the end. I'll just talk about specifically the last piece that I think is often forgotten around our organizing, and then I do want to open up to kind of answer some questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Is one, like, organizing has to be fun. And I think that we forget this a lot when we get very like into the minutia of like how bills and policy move and all of these things. But the organizing movement actually has to be irresistible. It has to be something that is visionary, imaginative, and also caked in people's culture. These are some visuals of things that inspire me a lot. Of course, Dolores Huerta on the right, from the farm workers movement. Of course, the Black labor movement from the 60s in Detroit. Um, and these are things that I lean on as like examples of ways that they engaged people, whether it was through art, whether it was through, if you ever read the Inner City Voice, which is an old 60s paper that the Black labor movement, of course, were writing, like they were putting cartoons in there were jokes, there were, of course, like, there's political analysis and like news of what's going on, but it's something that was like allowing them to access people in ways that we often forget when we get super into the like, how do we just move the issue and move the policy forward? For us, public, this is kind of like where it shows up for our work. One, like being able to make art around what we're organizing around, staging actions like town halls, where we actually talk to people and hear their stories about how our outage is impacting them. And on the left, you see our People's Power program that moved through a movement school last year to grapple with, one, community organizing, but also two, how do we build a leadership team together that is moving the issue forward. From that, you're able to do really, really cool programs, whether it's workshops like you see on the left, visionary workshops where we ask the question of, what does the energy grid look like for you? Or how do you want your energy grid to be changed? Being able to have that published in local publications, like writing about what we're doing, what we're moving forward. And in the middle, you see kind of what we do, like newsletters and flyers, talking to the community in their language and in their context. I always put "What up, doe" on all of my flyers that go out to both my neighborhood, but also to like my block, because I'm a block captain. So it's like things like that. Being able to be sensitive to people's culture and where they are is actually super vital, because often we miss that. We might show up and just talk at people, and they're like, okay, I don't understand anything you just said. I just know that like I need help. And so being able to be sensitive to what our external narrative is allows us to push back and fight major corporations narrative, where they're saying like, hey, we're benevolent actor, we should be responsible for your energy and you can't do anything about it. We actually want to be proposing a narrative that we can shape what our energy future is here in the state of Michigan. So I'll pause there. I will kind of open up, because I think there were a couple questions. I see folk are sharing resources for like just like learning around the IRA. I think also, yeah, I'm assuming maybe Maggie, like there's a couple resources that I want to share out, because there's some trainings next week actually around IRA and how to kind of track dollars down to the county level, and I would be able to want to share that maybe widely out with y'all.
Totally. Yeah. If you can get those links to me, I'll include them in the follow-up email, which will probably go out tomorrow with this recording and then any of those upcoming events.
Okay, cool. Because I like literally just signed up for one of them yesterday. So seeing the question from Hillary Thomas, so does DTE provide transparent data on its operations, emissions, and community impacts? So the short answer for this is no, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the narrative shaping that they do around their impact. So specifically, they have something called the IRP, which is where they address like, how are we moving forward over the next 10 to 15 years on energy? What are our investments and commitments going to be on energy? Often that report does not materialize into what's actually happening in real life, specifically in the realm of wind and solar investments. That's one place, but also too, just from like a pragmatic standpoint, when we're thinking about a state of like Michigan, where we have a cap on solar redistribution, it actually makes a lot of the things that they talk about not possible. Why? Because they're putting money into preserving that political context and then saying that they're making these big investments into solar. It's not the case. But also too, when we think about outages, I'm sure people have noticed this in the past 2 years. The outage map tends to change on the DTE app and the DTE website. It used to be you could see how many people were out of power. Now you actually open it and it shows you how many people have power. So it'll say 97% people have power. And you have to do some clicking to kind of see how many people specifically are out of power. Partially it's because like during outages, specifically in 2023, in February, where about 1 million people were out of power. People were posting to Facebook and to Twitter and different places these screenshots of the outage map, and it became this kind of big narrative tool for ratepayers to say like, hey, like this is how many people are out and how long it's going to take. So they've started doing certain things like that. Of course, like shifting some of the narrative around outages, but also too when we think about some of their green plans. So there's specifically like the uh, plan where people can pay 10 to 20 cent more per bill to lower their carbon footprint. These are some of the other ways that DTE is shaping narrative, but not necessarily doing very much on climate. So I'm seeing a question from Jelani. Yeah. Oh, no, Tanya, this is a really good point. And I still have to investigate it, but yeah. Jelani, so this may be a tall order, but could you offer a hypothesis for what practical changes would likely happen if DTE stopped investing in their narrative entirely? Well, a lot. Well, I think specifically, um, like that likely does not happen without some policy. So when we think about campaign finance, this is largely what the Taking Back Our Power campaign that some of our partners are working on right now is centered around is they actually need to weaken their ability to put money into our politics. Until that's the case, they have no incentive to not do it. Like if no one's stopping them from doing it, they're going to continue to put money into politics. They're going to continue to put money into our civic community in particular ways. Like there actually have to be some regulations and laws around that. But also too thinking about just like advertising, um, it's in their interest. Like they're a monopoly that is preserving kind of their power over Michigan. So I think it's a nice idea, but it has to actually come with some level of policy both in the capital, but probably more broadly, just thinking about kind of corporate spending and corporate contributions to politicians. So Don Farber, I know some states are looking at legislation to not allow utilities to use ratepayer money into lobbying 100%. Like all of those things are things that are needed, and I'm definitely in agreement on. But yeah, I guess I'll open it up just like if there's any other questions or like folk have just around because my expertise, like I am like this is full transparency. I am not an electrician. I am also not the biggest policy nut. Like I lean on our policy team a lot. What I am very versed in is the kind of organizing praxis and like how do we move collective action to influence some of these things. So I'm curious if there's like questions around some of that that folk have. Okay. Seeing none, hearing none. Well, Maggie, I'm down to pass back to you if there are no questions or concerns.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I also, Mary Alice said in the chat, you did a great job on these slides. I was going to email you afterwards and be like, I love the illustrations on the slides, but I can just say it now. So those are sick.
I appreciate
But
it.
yes, so thank you so much. And then Kamau, if you want to, I can just shoot you an email after this. But send me any of those upcoming events or any just like resources you want folks to have, and I'll make sure that those get emailed out to everybody. And then just so everyone on the call knows, I'm gonna drop a link in real quick. that has some of our other upcoming Midwest BDC events. So next Thursday, we have a building decarb specific kind of 101 training. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll be joined by Tanya, who's on the call today, to talk more about public utility commissions. I actually think that Public Utility Commissions 101 training is like a really good partner to this one. So it's like we're kind of getting the organizing background and then shifting into like, okay, engaging with the utilities themselves, like how do you jump into that whole world. So excited for that, and just grateful that everyone was able to join today, and we hope to see you again soon. All right, bye all.